I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast. Rob, today we're back to the duel between Wang Anshi and Su Dongpo.
Indeed.
Today we're looking at Su Dongpo, a poem called Mountain Village. It's part of a cycle of 5 poems. It's the 3rd poem in the cycle.
And it's a very short poem. So you should who's the translator on this one that you're working with?
Michael Fuller. He's written a book called Drifting Among Rivers and Lakes, Southern Song Dynasty Poetry, and the Problem of Literary History, which I think it's quite good. It has a lot of great translations. I'm just going to read his translation from the book of this poem. Praised be, an old man of 70 hangs a sickle at his waist. Praised be, that in the spring mountains the bamboo shoots and bracken are sweet. How could it be, having heard the Shao music, he has forgotten the savor of food? These past 3 months he has eaten without salt. Boom!
Right?
Now,
although the average reader, unless you're familiar with all the allusions, will go, huh? Okay.
But this poem got Su Dongpo banished.
This is one of the pieces of evidence they used, yeah.
Yeah.
It's not like this just one poem and they kicked him out, but it was a huge part of why. Yeah.
And it was it's insanely, I mean, this is a poetic smackdown.
Yeah, it is.
On Wang Anshi and his new policies, the Xinjiang. So as a part of Wang Anshi's reforms, he reformed the salt monopoly, which the salt monopoly has been in existence on and off in China as a sort of tax system for, I think, since around 600 BCE, there has been on and off some form of a tax monopoly.
Right.
So what is interesting is that this poem is saying Wang Anshi raised taxes on salt, and so this old man can't get any salt, which salt is, one of those things that's just necessary in a pre-modern, pre-refrigerator society. You just have to have salt. So the old man, he's 70, which, that in a society where aging is respected, that is a very, this is the age that old men should be, according to Confucius, eating meat. Oh, I'm sorry. According to Mencius, I believe, should be eating meat. So it's a fascinating poem. Again, we talked about Wang Anshi in our last episode. Wang Anshi is super direct. He's very much kai men jian shan, right? To open the door and see the mountain. It's just kind of right in your face. Whereas Su Dongpo, if you don't know what the music of Shao is, if you don't know about this particular policy, you have no idea what's going on.
Yeah, and when it talks about forgetting the music of Shao, what's he talking about? This is a Confucian reference.
It's a reference to a particular passage in the Lunyu where people forget, like they're so entertained or kind of
blown away by the stunning beauty of music from an much older era, the music from the Shao,
that they forget what food tastes like.
They don't even want to eat for weeks or months at a time. They're not even hungry.
Right.
And so this is kind of a dig in Su Dongpo's poem because he sees this old man, gathering bracken and whatnot, and says, is this the case that this guy, his life is so good, he's eating meat and everything, or he's heard the Shao music, the music of the ancients, and that's why he can't eat meat.
He's not even hungry.
He's not even hungry, and that's why he's doing this. And then he goes, no, it's because he doesn't have any salt. That's why. Yeah.
So he, he can't eat well, and this is a huge thing because economically, for a Confucian dynasty, a dynasty that kind of rests on these principles of Confucianism, if old men are starving,
something is wrong.
Something, is very wrong in the state of Denmark.
Exactly. I almost used that reference. Anyway, Lee got to Shakespeare first. Now, one of the things that's interesting to me about this poem, first, is just the complexity contained in 4 lines. There's something very dofu about it, where you can read it and go, okay, I can see why that would be a good poem, and then you read the history and go, oh, wow, this really is very subtle stuff here. But 2, we talk about Su Dongpo and Wang Anshi as being bitterly opposed, and they were, but not to the extent that, for example, Su Dongpo goes, the heck with the poor, who cares, right? He also has a deep sense of compassion for those who don't have anything. his approach is just vastly different.
So Su Dongpo is grounding his moral legitimacy in this poem based on that an old man is going hungry. Whereas Wang Anshi in the poem that we looked at in the last episode was grounding his moral legitimacy in just the poor itself. And I think you can kind of see the difference between the two. Wang Anshi is a Confucian, but he's making this argument that's more about the poor in general. Su Dongpo is kind of evoking this Confucian tradition of respecting the elders.
What's interesting, though, to me about it is that this rivalry has so many things in common with rivalries today as well, because
we said this is LBJ versus Reagan in poetry.
Exactly. Well, because a lot of what Wang Anshi wanted to get rid of, he had a point. It's not like, I mean, again, what was Roosevelt's New Deal a good idea? Well, it kind of depends on who you ask, right? But Wang Anshi wanted to break up the way that the elites were simply just administering everything.
And Su Dongpo represents those elite interests, right?
Now, Su Dongpo is going, hang on. The problem is not that the elites are administering everything. The problem is the kinds of elites. That's, the system's fine. We just have to get better people in. And Wang Anshi is going, no, it's not. The system is screwed up. And as long as you keep choosing your leaders based on who writes the nicest poetry, we're pretty much always going to be here.
And I mean, he was arguing for a direct transfer of wealth, redistribution of wealth from the wealthier to the poorer. So the conservative, wealthier folks are going to resist that. I can't think of any way this applies to current politics at all.
You're right. It is pretty distant when you think about it. But it is fascinating that it is so similar. And it's also interesting that Su Dongpo gets banished effectively for saying, it'd be great if the poor people had enough to eat, right?
Well, he's saying that old people,
not poor people, old people. And it's the reason it's so effective is because it is so highly Confucian. He's effectively using, I mean, it would be like using a biblical quotation in, say, 18th century Europe to explain why.
Or 19th century America. I mean, like Lincoln, Frederick Douglass, these orators.
They're drawing off of this tradition and this language.
And it's very easy for those audiences to connect.
And that's what he's doing. But of course, he does it much more subtly than someone like Wang Anshi did. But and that's, again, one of the reasons, I think, why this poem raised the hackles on the court, people in the court, because it is so subtle. It is so very well done. I mean, it demonstrates a command of the kind of learning that the court was supposed to represent, and he's using it against them.
I don't know that it would be that subtle to a contemporaneous audience.
It's possible, I suppose.
We don't have our time machine. It's still broken.
Maybe not so much subtle, so much as a command of the language of the day, right? So to have something effectively thrown in your face that's perfectly done Confucian thought, right? Only tweaked just a little bit, right? You can kind of even see a ruling elite being very intimidated by this because it's so well done and so skilled that how do you respond? Clearly, I can't write a poem like this, right? So
we should talk about Wang Anshi a little bit. Stephen Owen is, interestingly, in his anthology, he doesn't have that much Wang Anshi poetry.
He's not a fan.
Yeah, he's not a fan in a lot of ways. He calls Wang Anshi sort of totalitarian.
Like I think is scruffy old Confucian. Didn't he call him that? Something like that. Yeah.
He called him a totalitarian.
Okay.
And it's interesting because there is this kind of echo of Song Dynasty politics going on in China today, in the U.S. It's very funny because Su Dongpo is beloved. Today he is much more read than Wang Anshi's poetry.
Sure.
But you've got to ask, like, how much of that is politics?
Yeah, it could be. As from a purely poetic standpoint, just the craft, Su Dongpo is unquestionably more skilled.
So you like Su Dongpo more?
I do, yeah.
Okay.
We got in a mini debate about this last time. I think my point with Wang Anshi is when we talk about it, you tend to sort of just throw him in the garbage can as like a relic of a bygone era and he can't write. That's the way it sounds. And I'm like, no, sorry. I'm not willing to dismiss him entirely.
I mean, he's interesting as a historical artifact. I just don't think he's that good of a poet.
Compared to Su Dongpo, no. But there's still a lot that's very interesting in his poetry that is worth reading. And if we're talking about the Song, you have to, and this is actually something I wanted to bring up, is in some ways comparing the two is unfair because
Su Dongpo is so much better.
Well, because they're doing vastly different things, right? Wang Anshi is effectively trying to write like a Chan Buddhist monk who's withdrawn from the world and sees no need for ornamentation or anything like that. Su Dongpo is very much a man of the world who is trying to draw on China's vast reservoirs of literary wealth. They're doing very, very different things. I'm trying to think of a good modern parallel for that.
So I actually have a good parallel that I wanted to touch on. So we've talked before in Mao's Yan'an lectures.
Yeah.
Mao says, we need to get rid of all of this kind of highly elusive language that the literati get, and we need things simple enough for a peasant to understand. So you writers have to get in line and just speak simply in a way that a farmer could get it. And before Mao made all the writers do this, and then after Mao died, lots of the writers in China really wanted to be elusive, and that's like a very, it's characteristic of lots of literary traditions, but particularly of the Chinese literary tradition. Illusion is how kind of you make a lot of your points, and that's definitely true of this poem here. Without illusions, you don't have this Su Dongpo poem.
Right.
What I find fascinating is that there is a parallel both in the kind of literary theory of the Wang Anshi versus Su Dongpo debate and the politics, because Wang Anshi was advocating for this, at the time, radical equality of bringing the peasants up and giving them money and funding them. And Su Dongpo said, So you have this parallel of their politics and their literary theory, right?
Possibly, although, again, it's hard. I'm not a Song Dynasty scholar. This is part of the problem, but I don't know the extent to which Wang Anshi's poems would have been just simple for everybody poems, because this happens in the early 20th century with a lot of modern Chinese poets wanting to write quote-unquote poems for the people. We're going to bring in the modern life in the city, things that are just happening every day, right? The idea being this is going to be the thing that people connect with, right? Because it's their lives. We're talking about taxi cabs and buildings. That's what they see, right? No one read it because this is not what you think of as quote-unquote poetry. If you're a Chinese reader in the 20s and 30s, a poem about a taxi is not a poem. It just doesn't make any sense, right? So, and I don't know the extent to which someone reading Wang Anshi at the time would have just read you could just give a Wang Anshi poem to a peasant who would go, "Oh yeah, I totally resonate with this."
Yeah, I don't think peasants would have been reading this stuff, but at the very least, it would have been much more accessible to folks of lower classes. Whereas Su Dongpo poem is so elusive that you have to have these many years of Confucian education, which equals wealth, because if you're not working and instead you're getting educated, then you are necessarily at a certain level.
Right.
Whereas Wang Anshi's poems are maybe folks who only have done a couple of years of studies of the Confucian classic.
I honestly don't know. I mean, we read it because this is one of the problems too with reading it in translation. It inevitably kind of flattens it. So we're comparing Su Dongpo and Wang Anshi. Their registers are very similar. They're much more elusive, but they don't sound all that different. So a lot of the language that seems very, very basic, like Wang Anshi just being very direct, again, I don't know how that would have registered with readers from his era. I would tend to agree. It seems much simpler, but just as poetry in the 20s and 30s was written to be much simpler, but actually was anything but, I don't know. I don't know how this would have come across. When we read it, it does feel like something, for example, we could just toss to a bunch of undergrads and they'd go, "Oh, yeah, I get this. This is great." Whereas Su Dongpo, not so much. In his era, I don't know. So I get your point about Mao, but I also don't think Wang Anshi, we can just position him as like someone who went, there's all this convention, I'm going to strip it away and just write for the people, because he wasn't really writing for the people.
You agreed with me in the last episode that Wang Anshi is just Song Dynasty poetry with training wheels.
Yeah, I guess there's something to that in terms of teaching. Anyway, but we're stumbling into our weaknesses here because neither of us is educated enough in Song literary culture to know how this would have registered with people at the time. And How would have registered with Chan Buddhists? I don't know. Maybe this is total genius in Chan Buddhism, and elsewhere not so much. I don't know.
I think that's a great place to end it. I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast.